Rachel Reeves thought she could control the narrative. She believed she could stand before the cameras, deliver her rehearsed lines, and move on as if nothing had happened. But she was wrong. Because what started as a minor policy debate quickly escalated into one of the biggest political scandals in recent memory. One that has shattered the credibility of the Labour Party and exposed the dark underbelly of its leadership. The economy had already shown warning signs. Britain's GDP unexpectedly shrank by 0.1% in January, setting off alarms about a looming recession. And yet, instead of addressing the financial instability with measures that protected the most vulnerable, Rachel Reeves delivered a budget that slashed £5 billion from welfare while funneling billions into military spending. That decision alone would have been controversial, but what followed turned it into an outright catastrophe. Live on air, Reeves faced a backlash so intense, so unrelenting, that it left her visibly shaken. The audience wasn't buying her excuses. She tried to justify the cuts by calling them necessary tough decisions, but the crowd wasn't having it. Tough for whom? One audience member shot back. Not for you. Not for the politicians. It's tough for the people who can't afford rent, food, or heating. The room erupted in applause. Reeves looked stunned, completely unprepared for the sheer wave of anger coming her way. And then came the moment that changed everything. A bombshell revelation surfaced, a leaked internal memo exposing the real reason behind the welfare cuts. The money wasn't just being redirected to military spending. It was being strategically allocated to benefit private defense contractors with deep ties to Labour. The connections were damning. Powerful lobbying groups, political donors, and high-ranking officials were all implicated. The people weren't just being forced to tighten their belts, their hard-earned money was being siphoned off to line the pockets of the elite. The outrage was immediate. Social media exploded. Investigative journalists dug deeper, unearthing even more damning details. Reeves had built her political career on the image of being a competent economist, a woman with the financial expertise to steer Britain's economy. But now, her credibility was in free fall. Former colleagues from the Bank of England began speaking out, contradicting her carefully curated narrative. One insider revealed, she was never some financial mastermind. She was just another junior figure in a large team. The idea that she had any real influence is laughable. Had she lied about her credentials? Had she misled the public about her so-called expertise? The cracks in her reputation quickly turned into gaping holes. But even that wasn't the worst of it. As the backlash against Reeves intensified, so did the scrutiny of her financial dealings. And what emerged was truly explosive. Documents revealed that members of Reeves's inner circle, key advisors, donors, and even family members, had direct financial ties to the very industries that stood to benefit from the welfare cuts. This wasn't just incompetence. This was corruption. The scandal spiraled out of control. Protests erupted outside Parliament. Demonstrators flooded the streets holding signs that read "Stop the Betrayal" and "Labour Lies, People Die." The anger was unlike anything seen in years. Labour MPs scrambled to contain the damage, issuing vague statements, but the damage was already done. The party of the working class had been exposed as anything but. And Rachel Reeves. She had become the face of that betrayal. And then, the unthinkable happened. Another damning leak surfaced. This time, a set of internal emails that showed Labour officials had manipulated government reports to make the welfare cuts seem necessary. The data had been deliberately altered to paint a false picture of financial distress, justifying brutal cuts that were never actually required. This wasn't about balancing the budget. This was a deliberate act of deception. Reeves and her allies had knowingly inflicted financial hardship on Britain's most vulnerable while ensuring that their political backers profited from lucrative government contracts. The arrogance was staggering. The Labour leadership had banked on the idea that the public would simply forget, that the backlash would fade, that the media would move on. But they miscalculated. The British people weren't forgetting. The outrage wasn't fading, it was growing. Investigative journalists uncovered even more shocking financial ties between Labour politicians and private defence contractors. The same officials who had justified slashing welfare benefits were discovered to have personally benefited from financial deals linked to these companies. The money wasn't being redirected for national security. It was being laundered through a network of political insiders. And Reeves. She had nowhere left to hide. Every interview was a disaster. Every attempt at damage control backfired. The final nail in the coffin came during a heated television appearance where a journalist confronted her with a leaked internal memo. Holding the printed document in hand, the journalist read Reeves's own words aloud. "We need to control the narrative. If people start questioning where the money is really going, we'll lose control." Reeves's response? A stumbling mess of denial and deflection. "These documents are being taken out of context," she stammered. But the audience wasn't buying it. The truth was out. The Labour Party, which had once prided itself on representing the working people, had been caught red-handed orchestrating a system that exploited them for political gain. And Rachel Reeves. She wasn't just complicit, she was at the centre of it all. Calls for her resignation reached a fever pitch. Labour MPs, desperate to salvage what remained of their party's credibility, began distancing themselves from her. Whispers of crisis meetings and internal discussions about removing Reeves from her position flooded Westminster. And then, the final blow. A high-ranking government official came forward with yet another revelation. This time, it was recorded audio of a closed-door Labour meeting in which Reeves was caught strategizing how to suppress the backlash. "The outrage will fade," she was heard saying. "They always get angry at first, but in a few months, they'll move on." The arrogance. The contempt. The sheer disregard for the British public. It was over. Within hours, #Reeves must go was trending nationwide. Public opinion polls showed Labour's support collapsing. And the party leadership? They finally did what they should have done weeks ago. Behind closed doors, they made the decision. The announcement came swiftly, effective immediately. Rachel Reeves will be stepping down from her position. It was a spectacular fall from grace. The once powerful figure who had positioned herself as the economic brain of the Labour Party had been exposed as a fraud. Her political career was over. But this scandal isn't just about Rachel Reeves. Because as journalists continue digging, more names are surfacing. More connections are being exposed. If Reeves was willing to manipulate economic data, orchestrate welfare cuts, and enrich her allies, who else in Labour knew? Who else was involved? The British people are demanding answers. They won't settle for a single resignation. They want accountability. And as more revelations come to light, one thing is becoming painfully clear. Rachel Reeves was just the beginning. Rachel Reeves stood before the cameras, expecting another routine political debate. A few tough questions, some carefully scripted responses, and the usual deflection tactics. But what unfolded was nothing short of a public reckoning, a moment that exposed not only her own political failures but also the rot at the core of the Labour Party's leadership. The outrage erupted the moment she attempted to defend her decision to slash £5 billion from welfare while at the same time pouring billions into military spending. The audience was not fooled. They weren't there to listen to excuses. They were there for answers, and they weren't getting any. One audience member, visibly shaking with frustration, stood up and spoke the words that shattered Reeves' carefully rehearsed narrative. "Who's really paying the price? Not you. Not the politicians. It's us. The people who can't afford rent, food, or heating." The applause was deafening. Reeves, for the first time, looked genuinely caught off guard. She fumbled for words, her usual air of composure slipping away as she tried to explain herself. But the audience wasn't interested in explanations. They wanted accountability. And then came the first bombshell. Just as Reeves struggled to regain control, reports surfaced questioning her so-called expertise in finance and economics. She had built her reputation on being a former Bank of England official, an economic mastermind who understood Britain's financial system inside out. But now, former colleagues were stepping forward to contradict that claim. She wasn't some financial mastermind, said one insider. She was just another junior bureaucrat. The idea that she had any real influence is laughable. The public had been fed a carefully crafted lie. The Labour Party had positioned her as an economic heavyweight, but in reality, she was nothing more than a political operator with a fragile grasp on the very policies she was pushing. And that's when the real scandal exploded. A leaked internal document, marked confidential, landed in the hands of investigative journalists. And what it revealed was devastating. The £5 billion welfare cuts were never about fiscal responsibility. The money had already been earmarked, not for economic recovery, not to balance the books, but to benefit private defense contractors with deep financial ties to Labour politicians. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just poor policymaking. This was corruption. Labour had knowingly cut financial support for the most vulnerable: pensioners, struggling families, disabled citizens, while secretly securing massive defense contracts for their political allies. The backlash was instant. Social media exploded. Investigative reports kept coming, each revelation worse than the last. Protests erupted outside Parliament. The slogans on the placards were brutal. "Stop the betrayal." "Labour lies." "People die." "Reeves must go." And suddenly, Labour MPs, who had once stood firmly behind Reeves, began to distance themselves. They could see the writing on the wall. Reeves was no longer just a political figure. She was a liability. And then, another leak. This time, it was internal emails between senior Labour officials discussing how to manipulate government financial reports to make the cuts appear necessary. The documents showed a deliberate effort to manufacture a financial crisis, a tactic straight out of the worst playbooks of political deception. The numbers had been doctored. The economic projections had been manipulated. And the British people had been lied to. Reeves was no longer simply facing tough questions. She was now at the centre of one of the most brazen political deceptions in modern British history. She tried to fight back. She took to television, hoping to reclaim control of the narrative. But it was too late. Live on air, a journalist held up one of the leaked emails and read it aloud. "We need to control the narrative. If people start questioning where the money is really going, we'll lose control." Reeves, caught in the headlights, stammered through a weak denial. "These documents are being taken out of context." But the audience wasn't buying it. The nation wasn't buying it. And then came the final blow, an investigative report exposing Reeves' personal financial ties to lobbying firms and private defense contractors. For years, she had presented herself as a champion of the working class. But now, records revealed that she had received substantial consulting fees from financial firms with direct interests in government budget cuts and military contracts. The hypocrisy was staggering. She had told struggling families they needed to tighten their belts while funneling taxpayer money to corporate allies and donors. The British public had had enough. Her approval ratings collapsed overnight. Labour, desperate to contain the damage, held crisis meetings behind closed doors. Senior officials discussed removing her, not out of principle, not because they disagreed with her actions, but because she had been caught. And then came the moment she couldn't escape. A whistleblower, a former Labour insider, came forward with yet another damning revelation. It wasn't just the £5 billion in welfare cuts. It wasn't just the manipulated financial reports. It wasn't just the deep financial ties to defence contractors. The entire justification for the welfare cuts had been fabricated. According to internal government reports, Britain's economy was stable enough to maintain social programs without any major reductions. The cuts were never necessary. The crisis was a manufactured excuse, a deliberate move to shift money away from public welfare and into private hands. And the worst part? Rachel Reeves knew it. She had signed off on it. She had pushed the policy forward despite internal warnings that it would push thousands of families into poverty. The scandal was now out of control. She tried to hold on. She released a desperate statement, insisting that the cuts had been made in the best interest of the country. But no one was listening anymore. The Labour leadership, now fearing for its own survival, finally made its move. Behind closed doors, they reached a decision. Rachel Reeves had to go. And the announcement came swiftly. Effective immediately, Rachel Reeves will be stepping down from her position. Her fall was spectacular. The once rising star of Labour had been exposed as a fraud. But this scandal isn't just about Rachel Reeves. Because as journalists continue digging, more names are surfacing. More connections are being exposed. Who else in Labour knew? Who else was involved? And most importantly, who's next? Rachel Reeves thought she could weather the storm. That she could stand behind a podium, deliver a few scripted lines, and the scandal would start to fade. But this wasn't just another controversy. This was a political catastrophe, and it was spiraling out of control faster than anyone in Labour could have imagined. The streets were already filled with furious protesters. The slogans on their placards said it all. Stop the betrayal. Labour lies, people die. Reeves must go. And the anger wasn't just confined to the streets. It was spreading like wildfire across social media, across every news outlet, across Parliament itself. The British people had had enough. And the final nail in the coffin came when a leaked Labour Party memo revealed something truly shocking. Something that turned this from a crisis into a full-blown political scandal of historic proportions. The document, stamped confidential, proved that the welfare cuts Reeves had been defending weren't about economic responsibility at all. The money had been strategically redirected, not to reduce debt, not to stabilize the economy, but to funnel billions into lucrative military contracts. Let that sink in. While struggling families were told there was no money for welfare, while pensioners were being forced to make impossible choices between heating and food, while disabled citizens were left with nowhere to turn, the government was busy signing secretive deals with powerful defense contractors. The hypocrisy was staggering. And then came the moment that shattered Reeves' last remaining grip on power. She appeared at a press conference, flanked by desperate Labour aides, clutching notes filled with excuses that no one was going to believe. The cameras were rolling. The nation was watching. And then, the question that changed everything. Ms. Reeves, will you resign? The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since the scandal began, she had no answer. She looked down at her notes, then back up, but she could see it in the eyes of the journalists in the room. They already knew the answer. And so did the public. That same night, the headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Rachel Reeves resigns amid unprecedented political scandal. Her fall wasn't just swift, it was spectacular. And it didn't just take down her career. It dragged Labour into one of the worst crises in its modern history. The party that had spent years branding itself as the defender of the working class had been caught red-handed betraying them. The fallout was immediate. Labour MPs who had once defended her scrambled to distance themselves. Senior figures within the party rushed into crisis meetings, desperate to contain the damage. But it was too late. The public wasn't buying their excuses anymore. And now, the real question loomed over Westminster like a dark cloud. Who else knew? Because let's be clear, Reeves didn't orchestrate this alone. This kind of systematic deception doesn't happen without a network of enablers. There were meetings behind closed doors. There were strategic decisions made at the highest levels. The question isn't whether others were involved, it's how many. The investigations have already begun. Journalists aren't letting this go. New leaks are surfacing every day, each one more damning than the last. Financial records are being scrutinized. Defense contracts are being examined. And names, big names, are starting to surface. If Rachel Reeves was willing to sacrifice the most vulnerable to serve political and corporate interests, how many more in Labour did the same? And that leads to the most terrifying question of all. If this is what they were willing to do while in opposition, what would they have done in power? The British public has made it clear, they will not tolerate corruption. They will not stand by while their money is siphoned off into the hands of the elite. They will not be lied to, manipulated, and discarded by politicians who claim to represent them. Rachel Reeves thought she could control the damage. She thought she could ride out the storm. She was wrong. The storm has only just begun. And now, the people are watching. They're paying attention like never before. And someone else is about to fall.